We're in our series called Story Matters, talking about the grand narrative, God's big story. And today we're going to talk about the fact that you have a story, and that story takes place within God's story. And we're going to look at the different elements of the grand narrative and how we can use them to be able to tell our story well. So, Brenda, we've had fun with the grand narrative, and today the first thing we want to do is kind of locate ourselves in the story.
Yeah, I think you call this, or the theologians call this, the now and not yet. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
So where are we in the story, Alex?
So we talk about this story starts with the prologue, and then we see the creation, fall, redemption, restoration eras. And we see the story arc of Scripture being one that is moving from really from life, we call it life, new death, into new life. And the way that we locate ourselves in the story is we recognize that we live after the fall. We all kind of know instinctively. When we wake up in the morning and our bodies hurt, we recognize that we live in the fall. But we also live after redemption. And so I do this, if anyone can see me on the screen, because when I draw the arrows out, like the now and the not yet comes down off of the thing. So this is where we live right here, which is between, we're living in the fall, but we're also tasting the beginnings of the fruits of redemption that help us to know what's coming in restoration. And theologians do call that the now and the not yet. Some people like to call it the already and the not yet, that we're already experiencing some of the effects of what Christ purchased for us in redemption, but we have not yet fully experienced the restoration that is to come.
Yeah. And this really goes back to this idea of why we are able to hold or have to hold this tension between sorrowing and rejoicing in our hands, because we just live back and forth in this place that there's a lot to rejoice over and there's a lot to be sorrowful over. And our stories reflect that. We have in our stories places that are very joyful, and like you said, we get that taste of heaven. But there are places still where our stories are very sad and very broken, and quite frankly, we wonder, is it going to get better? Are things going to change? But one of the things I love about seeing our stories through the grand narrative is just how God's story does give structure and meaning to our stories. And it really tells us, yes, there is a better day coming. Like we can guarantee. It's not a hope so kind of hope. It is like a true fact. There is a better day coming. And today we just really want to talk about that in order to be good counselors, we don't just need to know God's story, but we need to be willing to share our true stories, the stories of our lives in the most true way, the way that God sees them. I think a lot of times when we think about telling our stories, we want to kind of mask our weaknesses or hide our weaknesses or not talk about the bad parts, like that's how God would tell the story. I think the scriptures really reflect that God is He's a messy storyteller. He doesn't mind telling the messy parts of the story, right? But to tell our stories this way, it takes a lot of vulnerability. And the very nature of vulnerability, or that word, means exposure. And I was I was reminded of this story in my life that I have held on to, thinking about counseling and exposure and vulnerability. This summer will be 20 years ago that I went to my 20th high school reunion. So I'm dating myself here, okay? But in order to look really good, I did some working out, and then I had to go get my tan. Had to get my tan on. And I'd never had a tan before. I have to say it was my first and my last tan experience. And after I tell you why, you'll understand. The first thing they had me do was come in. It took me to the little room. I had to undress, and then I had to go into this other small room that was just surrounded by shower curtains. And I am standing there naked. And I'm like, okay, how's this? What's going to happen next? Well, the next thing I know is this 20-something-year-old, really cute, Alex, really perky in every sort of way, very young, very perky girl comes in. And here I am with, naked, had 3 C-sections, nursed 3 babies. I mean, the old gray mule, she ain't what she used to be. And this girl whips out her airbrush with a generator now that's blowing cold air on me. Which created a whole nother set of issues, if you know what I mean. And she starts airbrushing me from top to bottom, turn around from bottom to top. And girl, I was so humiliated. That level of exposure was it was terrible. But I do remember walking out of there saying, I never want to forget what this level of exposure and humiliation feels like on a physical level. Because honestly, Alex, in a lot of ways, that's what it feels like when we tell a hard part of our story, and especially when we tell it the first time, right?
Yeah.
And so I think one of the benefits of telling our story truthfully is, we actually experience what it's going to be like for somebody else to tell their story. But it's hard because of the vulnerability it takes.
Yeah. I'm not going to, I was about to say it's a great picture. Maybe not. It's a great illustration. And you have cured me of ever wanting to get a spray tan.
Surely 20 years later, they're doing it much better now. I don't know.
I'm not taking the risk.
Just go to the tanning bed or the booth, where you get to get in there by yourself. So.
Yeah.
But don't listen to our episode about melanoma, right?
That's right. That's
too,
exactly right. Yeah. So, thinking about vulnerability, I want to make one distinction, that vulnerability is not the same as transparency. So transparency is a willingness to share my story with you, but vulnerability is telling you the impact that it has on me. And it goes back to what you said, Brenda, that vulnerability is about risk. It's about the fact that we we expose ourselves to risk. And so we need to be able to make that distinction that there is a place for transparency and there's a place for vulnerability.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because we're not advocating that you should tell the details of your story to every person all the time. But I think that we need to be in a place that we know our story and can tell our story to ourselves and to God, so that if we're called upon to share it with somebody else, we could do that as well. But, again, when I think about God sharing his story, he doesn't hold back. He tells everything. And that's because, I think that when we shrink back from the hardest or worst parts of our story, we really miss that opportunity to put the hero of our story on display, and that's Jesus. And that's exactly what God's story does. God doesn't leave out the messy parts, because it's in those messy parts that really the light, the spotlight is put on the person and work of Jesus.
Yeah. So with that lead in, it might feel a little scary to talk about telling your story.
Right?
And with that picture in your mind.
Illustration.
Yeah.
Think of a cartoon.
Yeah.
Think of a cartoon. That'll help.
But we want to make the argument that that telling our story is helpful for many things. One, it helps us to know how to apply God's story to our everyday lives. So as we tell our story, we recognize those places that we don't align with God's story, and then we're able to apply his story to our lives. The other thing is that as we tell our story, we recognize the places that we don't align with God's story in our minds, in the ways that we think about things. This is like what 1 Peter talks about, of the feudal ways passed down from our forefathers. Often our story is being influenced by things that happened before we even came into the story.
That's right.
And we believe things, or we know things, or we accept things culturally in our families that actually are not what God says about us, or what God says is true. So we recognize ways that we don't align with God's stories in truth, but we also recognize maybe ways that our behavior doesn't align with God's story. And then telling our story helps us to walk with others in their story. As we are able to tell our own story, we're going to be able to listen in a different way to other people's story. And all of that is going to help build our faith as we see God's plan of restoration come to life in our lives and in the lives of others. Our faith is built. Like, we're able to look back to the past in ways that he's met us, and then we're able to look forward to the future with hope and faith that he's going to continue to do that, and that all of these things that we experienced in the fall are going to be restored to us.
Yeah, and I think we also need to recognize that we need community, we need people we can be intimate enough to tell our stories to, because there are things about our stories that we don't even recognize or can give language to until somebody else comes along. And I'm thinking about a teaching, Alex, that you and I did together And as I was sharing a part of my testimony, you made reference to the fact that I was date raped. And I remember being so stunned when you said that, because I had actually not even recognized that as a part of my story. And it really, that just recognizing that changed so much about like, where was I responsible? Where was I not responsible? There was, so many things about that. It was very, very disorienting for me for a moment, but it's helped me be able to see my story in a truer light and to tell my story in a better light. And also, I just think that when we share our stories, then we help somebody comprehend their own story better because of all the common themes of sin and suffering. And we learn that we're not alone in our stories. And that's one of the enemy's greatest, seductions maybe, or greatest lies he tells us, or greatest ways to derail us, is to tell us that we're alone, that nobody's experienced this. And then I know you and I both love the neurosciences. We loved having Dr. Kurt Thompson on, and just this whole discipline of neurotheology. But neuroscience is really telling us the value of storytelling for the listener and the teller. It's been proven to foster greater relational connections, because when we tell stories, it releases the bonding hormones that we have. And then it also increases our capacity for empathy by stimulating empathy networks in the brain. And a lot of times we find that, if somebody hasn't told their story, I just think this whole idea of empathy, I was meeting with a woman who had a really terrible childhood, but she said, I like zero to little empathy or compassion for other people. But she had never shared her story. As the first person she had shared her story with, and she had never, ever experienced her story the way God shared it and saw it, and was not able to receive his comfort, and so therefore didn't have comfort to give other people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you're touching on what Kurt Thompson talks about a lot, is that right brain to right brain experience, that we don't have a lot of those right brain to right brain experiences where we allow someone to into our pain and know that they're feeling pain too, because we're feeling pain, and it's very bonding, very connecting. And when we think about our churches, we realize that a lot of our church experience is left-brained experience. It is thinking, analytical, all these things, and not a lot of feeling and experiencing. So there's a great book that I love called The Other Side of Church, that's even talking about how do we begin to integrate the right brain experience into church. And I think one of the main ways is telling our stories. I always advocate for testimony time in the worship service. And just came from a women's retreat where I taught for 4 days, and everybody's favorite time is when the women in the room share their stories, right? It's always humbling, but always also just reinforcing to what I'm teaching of like sharing your story is a powerful tool. And those women will remember each other's stories far longer than they'll remember the facts and structures that I taught them, because there's also something that neuroscience tells us, is that all areas of our brain light up when we tell story and when we hear story. And so we're really learning them in ways that we can't learn just facts and figures. And so I think story is very important and needs to be incorporated more in our churches.
I agree with that. And I like that you use the word testimony, because I think so often we think about, we have one testimony of how we've come to Christ. But every story we tell, and any story we tell, where we are actually able to engage the Lord and show the Lord working in our life in some way, is a testimony to his faithfulness. And so we need those stories all the time with one another. In fact, some of the ways that I know I'll get through my story is because I just heard your story of God's faithfulness, Well, sometimes it's hard to tell our true stories. And, I think one of the things we have to consider is what keeps us from telling other people our true stories. I think it's easy to keep the mask up. It's easy to tell stories in ways that we want people to view us, as opposed to really getting real. So what do you think are some of the risks that we encounter, or reasons why we don't share our stories truthfully or wholly?
Yeah, I think we feel first and foremost rejection, that if we share that part of ourselves, someone will not want to be in relationship with us anymore. we fear the shame that comes along with telling our story, and ironically, even though we are engaging with someone else, we fear the isolation that the shame or rejection could bring. And so and then I hear a lot of people talk about, I don't want to tell my story because I don't want to burden people. I'm supposed to bear other people's burdens. It would be selfish for me to share my story. Kind of ignoring that part of Galatians 6 that says, like, bear one another's burdens. And I always like to remind people, like, how are other people going to bear your burdens if you never tell anything about your story?
That's right. Well, and I think this is one of the reasons people seek out professionals. Because it's when we talk about vulnerability and being at risk, well, there's no risk. And again, we've talked about, we're professional ministry counselors, and so we're not saying that that's bad or wrong, but I just think that maybe the strength or the health of our community, our faith community, is probably very much rooted in how risk-free is it to be vulnerable with one another. Can we really be, truly known and still be truly loved? And so what will help us tell our stories more authentically? I think we have to think through, like, if there's great risk, then what's going to move us to safety? What's going to make it where we can be more real with one another? And I know for me, the more that I've grown just in the love of Christ, being anchored that I am fully known and fully loved by Him. Like, if the God of the universe sees me this way, then what does it really matter, Alex, how you see me, right? But I just think that with Him, there's no shame, there's no guilt, there's no fear of rejection. And I think to the degree that we can embrace or know or experience, and I do think it's an experiential knowing, like, as we walk with God, we really come to know how much He does love us. Like, He says He loves us. Like, God says He loves us, but I know He loves me as I do life and I see His love and I experience His love. So I think the more that we're rooted and anchored there, the more freedom, the more courage we're going to have to share our true story.
Yeah. My counselees call this my dance move, because I always say, like, we have to orient vertically first before we can orient horizontally. And if we don't know that we're grounded in the love of God, it's going to be very difficult to move out in vulnerability in any sustained way. We may venture out, but we won't venture out for long. And so that takes us back really to our episode on lament. I really believe that we experience that connection to God's love when we pour out our story to Him.
Yes.
And so we have actually several podcasts on lament that I think are helpful to know how to do that. But then we do need to seek out safe people who can hold our stories. And they do need to be safe. They need to be people who we believe can listen and understand that listening is a sacred act. It is sacred to hold someone's story. We both have probably had many people tell us, I've never told anyone this.
Right.
And when you enter into that sacred space where people are giving words to their experience for the first time with another person, we have to be able to hold that. We have to be able to tune well where we see them and hear them. And then we have to be able to contain or hold what they've told us. We have to be able to create a place that we are not overwhelmed by their story, but that we, someone has said steward it well. I think we talked about that earlier, where we steward their story well, because we're able to create a space where we're not afraid of the brokenness that they bring us. We're not afraid of even the darkness oftentimes that is in people's story. And that can be a very hard thing to do. We have to hold on to ourselves in that time. We have to be very aware of our own emotional internal world as we listen, and then hold space for them to continue to be able to talk. And that's a sacred space, because it opens up a space, as we've said before, for the Holy Spirit. It's not just two of you in the room at that point. The Holy Spirit's there working and revealing our hearts revealing the hearts of both people, not just the one speaking, and telling us more about who we are and who God is, and what our relationship to Him is really like, if we're able to hold that space well for people.
Yeah, and when you talk about holding the space well, or making space, I just think, again, if you haven't worked through your own story, then you really have not made space for somebody else's story. And there will be things, in your own story. I mean, I think one of the reasons we get overwhelmed is, one, I want to have the answer, as opposed to just, I think, again, we're kind of taking this approach that if counseling is story work, then we don't always have to have the answer. Like just knowing that God is doing something through the Holy Spirit, body and soul, just as we share our stories with one another and we bear testimony to who he is and what he's done. I just lost my train of thought.
I was thinking when you said that, I've talked about Allender Center, but I don't know that I've ever been really specific. But there are 3 levels of what I did in Allender Center. The first level is you learning how to tell your story in a group. The second level is you're beginning to facilitate the group time, and you're facilitating the way the group interacts with the storyteller. And it's still pretty focused on the storyteller, like even though you're kind of practicing facilitating. But level 3 is really interesting, and in my opinion really genius, because at level 3 other people are telling their stories and you're telling your story, but when you facilitate, the emphasis is not on what the storyteller just told. The emphasis is actually on you as the facilitator. And now people are asking you questions like, when they were talking about their relationship with their mom, what did that make you think? Because this happened with your mom. And when they were saying about their dad, because people now know your story so well, they're asking you how someone else's story is impacting you, and can you be aware of that impact on you? Because if you can, and you can hold your own emotions, you can engage with the person in front of you. And boy, I've taught for years that listening is a set of skills and listening is a sacred thing, but I don't think I ever experienced it to that level until people were asking me particular things about my story and how I was handling the information that was coming at me from the storyteller. And but wow, what an amazing training that really what they were showing us is you don't lose yourself as you become a listener. You actually have to hold yourself and hold the person who's telling the story, which is a really delicate dance that's guided by the Spirit. But I love that, because if you disappear, the person knows it. Like if you check out because it's hard to hear what they're saying, they can feel it. And the flip side of that, if you go all into them, where they become just a problem for you to solve, and you disappear in that way, like you don't want the story to touch you emotionally, you just want to solve their problem, they can feel that too. They just feel like a project. So listening is so much of a delicate art that I think we have to continually talk about how hard it is, how meaningful it is, and how holy it is.
That's so good. As we're talking, I just thought this necessity that we have to know God's story. And we've talked about the competing stories that come in as we are making sense of our stories. We come out of God's story, and then God brings us back into his story. And so we bring 2 stories. When we are listening to somebody else's story, we bring God's story, and we bring our story, whether or not we're living out of our story, his story in our story, if that makes sense. And because we're perceivers, and because of the way that we make assumptions and the beliefs that we bring as we're listening, and I think particularly in counseling, as we begin to move toward actually ministering with words to somebody, if our story hasn't already been, I don't know, for lack of better words, maybe arrested or come under the loving control, or in some ways been comforted or touched by God, then I think it really inhibits our ability to listen to somebody's story and then to have anything meaningful to say when the right time comes to speak. Well, Jesus is always the point of the story. Alex, we know that. He's our model, and he's our motivation for storytelling. Jesus was, in fact, a brilliant storyteller himself. But I just think about in our world, in the midst of so many, hero stories, Jesus didn't come to tell us a different story, but he came to give us a better story. And he left heaven and made himself completely vulnerable. And he chose to fully expose himself that we could have intimacy with the Father. And by him coming to earth, leaving heaven and exposing himself, he's able to empathize in our weaknesses. And when we have truly received his comfort, then we can comfort others with the comfort we have received. And so I think it's just this beautiful model and motivation, and this understanding of all of this story work really just takes us more into walking with Jesus deeply, more intimately.
Yeah, I love that. So we want to kind of walk people through how to tell their story, and we're going to start with the grand narrative. We have a handout for this to help kind of keep it organized in people's minds, but we told the grand narrative story in previous podcast. Today, what we want to do is we want to use some orienting questions and ideas to help people understand what each part of the story is doing, what it's telling, and then we want to connect that to how we tell our own personal story. So we like to start, as we said before, with the prologue, because there's a story before the story. And the prologue...
I need to also, hey, just really quickly, I do want to say this. I want to give a shout out to my professor, Dr. Kellerman, because he's actually the first person I ever heard use prologue.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought it was so genius. Yeah. And so I know that has always just stuck with me. So I just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Kellerman.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kellerman. For the idea of prologue, that creation doesn't actually, even Genesis 1 doesn't begin at creation, but it says in the beginning God, that God already existed. And so what the prologue does is it orients us to what is truth, who's in charge, who gets to tell the story of the whole world, and what is the story that he is telling. And so there's an element of the prologue that causes us to look at our own story and ask the question, like, what was in place before we came into being? What truth, so to speak, what authorities were speaking into our story before we were even born? And that's often the things that have shaped us that we may not even realize. And then in creation, we're asking specifically, who am I? And this is more things that we know about ourselves, about who we are as a person, how we were created, what are the people, the experiences, the events that shaped us as a person, what's our personality, what are characteristics of our culture, our family of origin, and what are some of our core desires. So we're looking at how we were formed. This is our formation era, and so many different things can be talked about here, even just the way our bodies function in creation. Then in the fall, where we recognize that the world fell into sin and suffering, we ask the question, why do I suffer? That becomes just an orienting question. And we're really struggling with, what is the sin, or what is the impact of sin and suffering on us? And then how do we experience sin and suffering in the world? What are some life dominating sin or suffering struggles that we struggle with? And we see just the affliction of our story. And then in redemption, because we all are experiencing that affliction, in redemption, we're asking the question, who's going to rescue me? And I like to say, who or what am I looking to for refuge and rescue? And for all of us, even those of us who know Christ, we have looked to other things for refuge and rescue besides him. We're all looking for salvation. We all want a hero, or we want to be the hero of the story when only he is. And so we need to orient to who we're looking to for that salvation. And then in restoration, we're kind of asking a question about our final hope, or overall, what is driving us? What is keeping us going is what I like to say. And we call that our aspiration. What are we moving towards? What keeps us going on a daily basis? Where do we see this story going, and what are we really living for? So when we think about these eras of the story, we actually want to try two different things today to flesh it out. One, Brenda, you're going to give the way that you could give your own big picture testimony. The grand narrative is a great way to be able to share your testimony pretty shortly, pretty succinctly, as you follow that structure. And then I'm going to show how you can take a particular area of sin or suffering and tell that one story, that one testimony through the grand narrative. So one's going to be a big picture story and one's going to be a very particular story. And I think people will be able to hear that as we tell it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, mine is going to basically be the story of how I came to Christ. And then you'll focus on a story having come to Christ, but still a struggle within the story. So I'm going to give a very high level flyover. This is, I'm going to say, my 2 to 3 or my 3-minute testimony, right? Mm-hmm. And depending on the context of who I'm talking to, I could go deeper into certain parts of it that are relevant. But my prologue is that my mother was born and raised in Germany and had a very strict Catholic upbringing. And remember, prologue is kind of the orientation to truth, the story before the story. I should have said that. And my father was raised in an agnostic home. And so I think my mother, had this very strict sense of who God was, that he was much more a demanding God. My dad had no really sense of God except maybe he set the world in motion. And so my parents met, and this would get into my creation story of who am I. Well, my dad was in Germany on a tour with the military, and my mother came back to the States with him. She was 21 years old, and when she came, she actually left the church. And interestingly enough, though, she still had a really strong sense of, I think, her spiritual roots. And they didn't want to be Catholic. They didn't know what to be. And so I think that they landed somewhere in the middle and decided to have my sister and I both baptized as infants in the Lutheran church and dedicated to God. Mm-hmm. Which, as I was writing this, I was really thinking about just, even as a young child, even though I wasn't raised in a Christian home, but just that act of dedicating us to the Lord. Mm-hmm. That's kind of powerful to me now looking back. While my parents were wonderful in many ways, there was no instruction in the faith. We didn't go to church as a family. I wasn't raised in church. And I would basically describe that my views or my religious upbringing was very much God and country, with my mother being very pro-God and my dad being military pro-country. And so we saluted the flag and we said amen. So, so the fall part of my story is really like how I came to Christ, maybe the area or what God was working through to open my eyes to his love and his grace. There was an incident that led me to faith my freshman year of college, which resulted in sin and misery and death. And I just remained under a burden of guilt and shame and contemplation to the point that I even contemplated ending my life. This is kind of one of these areas that I will say I'm being transparent but not vulnerable, because this is not necessarily the forum that I would want to share the details of my fall story, but I certainly have shared it one-on-one with people and in smaller groups where I felt like it was appropriate to do so. But then moving on to the redemption part of my story, this is probably true of many of us, that God used or took the lowest part of my life, the worst part of my story, to shine his amazing grace and love into my heart. Mm-hmm. And a fellow co-worker and student where I went to school one day shared the forgiveness of Christ with me. And that if I didn't want my life, God wanted it, and he could take it and he would use it. Mm-hmm. And so that's when I surrendered my life to Christ. I accepted his forgiveness. There was a song by Kathy Tricoli. It was called Stubborn Love. Mm-hmm. And I remember after I got saved, I would listen to it and cry. It's your stubborn love. It never lets go of me. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, the song goes on, but it was I just remember listening to that because I really could just see God's stubborn love really throughout my life, going back to my infant dedication to the Lord, And then the restoration part of my story would be, this idea of like the aspiration, the hope. And for me personally, the very thing that was lost in the sin part of my story as an unbeliever is the very thing I know will be fully restored when I am with Jesus. Mm-hmm. And all of that will be made right, and I will get to see the rightness of that. Mm-hmm. So, just a simple, short way to share my testimony, but I hope that maybe it will give some structure for somebody else. If you're like, I don't really know how to share my testimony, I think this is a great way to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just say with both of these examples, the the magic in this is not listening to us do it, it's in doing it yourself. Like, you really can't assimilate this information about the grand narrative fully until you have written some of these for yourself. And then the beauty of it to me is once you do it, like I call it seeing it. Like once I can see the grand narrative in my own story and I'm able to write it and express it, like what I wrote, what I'm about to do, and I don't know how long yours took you, Brenda, but I mean, maybe tops 10 minutes, but maybe 5 minutes. Like once you begin to think in this way because you've practiced with the grand narrative and you can see the structure and you kind of feel the rhythm of it, you'll not only be able to tell multiple stories of your own life through this grid, you'll be able to hear it when other people are talking. And I think that's what gets people the most excited, is because they've interacted with their story, and then when they start to be able to hear it, either because they're watching a Disney movie and they see the grand narrative unfold even in a Disney movie, or they're listening to a friend talk and they go, oh my gosh, they're stuck in their redemption story, they're looking for another hero, and they're not, when like they get really excited of how practical this can be. So I would just encourage people, if it's like, oh yeah, that's easy for Brenda and Alex, it's only easy for Brenda and Alex because we've done it over and over and over again, and we've engaged our own story and made ourselves use the structure.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. Okay, so we're going to use a struggle in your life now to show how this framework is helpful to, I think, one, for self-counsel, Alex. This is a great self-counseling tool to understand more about your struggle and where God is in it. And then even to your point, to see like, how far have I come? How far do I have to go? Like, where has God been in the story? Where is he leading me in this story? And then also it's a great way or structure to be able to share a struggle with somebody else, and maybe even to connect with somebody else's story in this way. So we said that when you're using a struggle, a lot of times it's helpful to start with the fall part of the story instead of with the prologue. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start with the fall part of your story, then we'll go back to prologue and work through. So the fall part of the story is the affliction. So we're asking, where's the affliction? Why do I suffer? What are the dominant lies that you fight against about God or yourself? In your case, we're looking for a dominating sin struggle and the impact that it's had on you. So can you share that with us?
So first of all, we have already unpacked this struggle of mine in the Perfectionism podcast. So this is going to be a familiar story. And that's actually why I chose it. Not because I love to hash this out and tell it again, but because I thought it would be helpful for us to share a story that we talked about outside of the grand narrative format, and then bring it into the grand narrative format and be able to hear the same material, but presented with this structure. So this is one of many sin struggles, but definitely a life-dominating one that I have with perfectionism, self-righteousness, being critical, being angry and resentful for most of my life, just all the little tentacles that come out from perfectionism. I like to say that I didn't always think I had to be the best at everything, but I did believe I had to do it all, and so I drove myself very hard to do it all. And a lot of this goes back to my prologue and creation story that I look back now and realize like I internalized a belief. I don't think I was conscious of this then, but now that I look back, I realize I internalized a belief that my mom gave up a lot to have me, and so I wanted to pay her back. I wanted to do all the things that she didn't get to do. And that drove me in this constant cycle of do.
I like what you just pointed out there, that oftentimes these things are not conscious at the moment, but looking back. I heard somebody say, life is lived forward, but only understood looking backwards. And so it's as you look back, you begin to see like, oh, the prologue, like what was my truth orientation? Because this goes back to my mom and what was happening in her life before I ever came along. So can you tell us a little bit more about the story with your mom and your prologue?
Yeah, so my mom was 17 and in high school when she, and definitely on her way to college, very smart, very driven. and she became pregnant with me. And so she chose to keep me to get married. And so she got pregnant, she got married, she graduated from high school, and she stayed in her small town to raise me. And so much of just that part of my story has shaped just the way that I came into the world and the way that I think saw my world. And that's what that prologue is.
Mm-hmm. And I like that, we talk about sometimes this idea of prologue, what is the truth, like the counseling category we say is orientation, can be hard to understand. Why is the story before my story the truth, that my truth, if you will, the truth I live out of? But I think that's the connection we're trying to make, is like there is a truth that you're born into that started before.
Yeah.
and it's never perfect, and that's why we all have to go back to the perfect story of God's truth and the truth. And his story actually being the story we all have to go back to. There's nobody that doesn't have to go back, because all of us are born into stories that are not wholly or fully true, even though they may have good components to them. So that brings you to the point now in the creation part of your story, the formation. And tell us a little bit about your growing up in your family and some of the views and beliefs that you actually took away from your family.
And so these overlap a little bit. And when I have people writing their grand narrative, they'll often ask me, like, does this belong in prologue or creation? And sometimes it's a little bit of both, because prologue is what shaped your thinking, but your creation is what shaped you, so they do overlap. So like you, Brenda, I was actually raised in a very German influenced culture in South Central Pennsylvania, which is very focused on hard work, discipline, all of those things. So that's the air that I breathe. And then one of the things that my mom used to say to me, completely out of love, was, don't do it the way I do it, you do it right. I mean, she wanted to spare me the pain that she experienced of being pregnant at 17. And so I think that, combined with being a firstborn, just a firstborn, highly verbal female, and led me into this life of perfectionism, like all those things. A culture centered on hard work and discipline. You don't do it the way I do it, you do it right. And then being a firstborn female, I just kind of came into the world, I think, primed in some ways. And then probably that they shaped my personality and became my personality of being what I call an overproducer.
I was even thinking, Alex, that part of our creation story is the time and history and culture we come into. And I'm just thinking about the time that even you were born, the stigma of an unplanned pregnancy, right?
Yes.
For your mom, and even for you, that you've got this really young mama. You're a teenager, and your mom is super young, and all the things that just come with that culturally that could also make it really hard.
Yeah. And even if we're going to add this, the honest truth is my mom became a Christian when I was about 5 and put me in a Christian school in 2nd grade. And so now I'm not just in a German culture of hard work. I'm in a Christian culture that's very focused on behavior. We joined a very conservative Baptist church and a very conservative Christian school. And so, yes, even the Christian culture itself, I think, shaped this perfectionism of you have to do it right. And as much good and so much beauty as I experienced there, it did shape my sin struggle. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, the influences on the heart are real. They are really real. And I just need to stop here and say I'm so thankful for the sacrifice your mom made and the commitment that she had, because you're a gift to the church and to the world and to my life. And I'm just so thankful, just that she bore that shame and that guilt to have you. So anyway, that's just a part of her story and the beauty of what God did in her story. But it's also your story too. So let's move now to the redemption piece. And we call this counseling category, that salvation piece, that place of like, who will rescue me? And Alice, we talk about, how we try to either find pseudo saviors and other things, or even how we try to prop ourselves up as, the savior, our own savior in the bootstrapping. So what was it like for you? How did you deal with the perfectionism and how did Christ become the real hero of your story?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very fortunate one in the sense that I really don't remember much of my life without Christ. My mom did share the gospel with me. I think I was about 5 years old, and almost because of this sense that I was bad or wrong, I had no trouble accepting the part of the gospel that said you're a sinner and you need a savior. Like, even very young, that's what I distinctly remember when my mom, I know where we were, I know what she said, and I had no trouble believing I needed somebody to help me. And yet, even though I became a Christian at a young age, I think I still found a lot of refuge in getting it right and achievement and getting the affirmation I got from that achieving. And so I drove myself very hard. I share this part of my story, and I can honestly tell you, like, it's hard for me to say this. It feels like it could be a really prideful thing, but it is very hard for me to admit that in both high school and college, my senior year of both, I was voted best all around. And it's just, to me, it is such a testimony of how hard I drove myself. And I had to find out the hard way that all of that overproduction was taking its toll on my body and my soul, on my relationships. And I continue to have to still remember that my worth is not in what I do, and that and this was probably a turning point for me. I really believed that I had to do it right. And to get to this phrase that Jesus lived the perfect life for me. Like that was the precise application of the gospel that I had to continue to remind myself of, and continue to have to remind myself of, that the perfect life has already been lived for me. I don't have to do it. And so I think what's beautiful about the salvation part of our story, even when we see the places where we've chased substitute saviors, is that those substitute saviors lead us to so much destruction, and we have to taste that destruction. It's just part of our human experience. We have to taste our destruction to really know the beauty of Christ.
Yes, we do. I would really encourage anybody who struggles in this area of perfectionism to listen to our perfectionism podcast. We can link that in our show notes for this one, because you really talk more deeply about this issue and really how to allow Christ, or believe, or come to live out of Christ's perfection on your behalf. So the final part of the story on God's grand narrative is restoration. And our category for counseling is aspiration, or this idea of hope. Where do I place my hope? We can look at our longings, our regrets, and disappointments to see what we are hoping for, where we are hopeless or lacking hope oftentimes. But for you, Alex, we talk about, what keeps us going. What are we living for? Where do we see the story moving? And what's that been like for you?
Well, I think any perfectionists will know, like, we long for the day when we can lay ourselves down. Like, we ourselves are our own burden. And so to look forward to the day when we see the perfection of Jesus, the beauty of Jesus, and can lay down this sense of self, this sense of shame that comes with self that drives us, and fully enter into the rest that he's prepared for us. Like, that is going to be a rest to really be enjoyed. And so that's the hope, or the aspiration, that continues to remind me of the preciousness of Jesus, but also how to restructure even the day-to-day life here, is that I don't have to live out of it. I can begin to taste that rest now.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the now and not yet, right? And I also just think about when we look to substitute gods to do what only God can do for us, it is destructive, and the word that comes to my mind is exhaustion. It's exhausting. It's exhausting to try to be God or Jesus.
Yes.
It just is. So
Yeah.
Rest. Yes, eternal rest. And it's such a beautiful, beautiful word. Well, I certainly hope, Alex, that this has been a helpful episode. We're going to post in our show notes a link to some of the handouts we have for this series. I think, in fact, maybe these will make more sense if you can even follow an outline or look at the questions, might be helpful, or go back after listening and go through those. And again, we just want to really encourage you not just to listen to this for yourself, but to actually take up your own story, your testimony, and or a struggle in your life, and walk through this and begin to see how the Holy Spirit ministers to your own heart as you sit with the wonderful counselor, as you begin to map your story onto his story, and how much beauty there is in both your testimony, but also in the continual struggles as he meets you in those. I don't know, just in terms of wrap up, is there anything that we want to just say to wrap things up?
And maybe just we'll hit the high points that good counselors know their own stories and know how that fits into God's story, and that knowing our stories helps us to listen well to other people, and it helps to build our faith. And then knowing these key questions of the grand narrative can become a framework for us to be able to tell our story well and to listen well to others. And so, again, we just challenge people to not just listen, but to actually interact with these questions and take the pencil and the paper and make yourself write it down. It'll bear fruit.
Yeah, that's great, Alex. Well, thanks so much. This has been fun, and we've got some more to come to unpack this, and we're looking forward to doing that in future episodes.